Hello, welcome back, another live stream, and today we're going to talk about the Dungeon Master Guide. Now, I know there are probably quite a few people who are kind of confused that I've never reviewed the Dungeon Master Guide. Why is that? Why have I never ever done anything with it? Why have I never told you my opinion of this book? Well, today I'm going to be completely honest. I'm going to give you everything that you might want to know about the Dungeon Master Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5e and my honest opinion of the book, because I have kept it to myself for good reason. So here we go. The sound is working, the picture seems to be working fine. So I want you to grab some drink, some food, settle down. This is going to be a long discussion. I suspect it will take me some time to get through everything, because the Dungeon Master Guide is a big book. All right, so before you all run away and freak out thinking that, I have nothing but bad things today and it's just going to be a rant. No, it's not just going to be bad things, but we need to be honest about what we're getting in terms of a product. So let's start, shall we? Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. But specifically, I was going to talk about Gary Gygax. No, I wasn't. But I'm going to talk about an important book that we really should be using more, but often we don't. And if you have been following my channel, you'll know I have done a poll. And I asked during that poll, with regard to the Dungeon Master Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5e, how often did people use it, and could they explain what they used it for? And it's really interesting, those figures, because it's exactly what I suspected. There is a range of people who use it every day. There's a range of people who use it every week. Some who use it fortnightly, some who are using it every month, some people who have never used it. In fact, the number of people who have never used this book, or rarely use this book, or use only a small fraction of the book, is quite large, at least a third, if not more. So that's a telling factor. This is one of the reasons why I have reluctantly considered the Dungeon Master Guide a topic I don't discuss. But the day has come, and so we're going to be honest. I'm going to be honest, but I'm going to be quite scathing at times with a product that really should have been better than it is. And I will explain, for those of you who are concerned that I am not going to be balanced about this whole discussion, I can assure you I have taken some time to write down and be as specific as I can about what I don't like about this book. And there are lots of things. And the things that I do like about this book, because there are things that are good about this book, and therefore we need to sort of focus on the things that are going to work for you. Because this has always been the focus of this channel. What will work for you and what won't work for you. All right, starting off, there is a reason that I have never reviewed the Dungeon Master Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5e. And the reason is, it is, in my opinion, the worst Wizards of the Coast book that they've made in terms of Dungeon Master Guides. In terms of a Dungeon Master Guide, this is the worst one I have seen. Now, I'm sure there'll be people who will say, oh, no, there are other ones that are much worse than this. If you look at the very first Dungeon Master Guide, hang on, Wizards of the Coast didn't make the very first Dungeon Master Guide. So we don't go there. Let's talk about what Wizards of the Coast has made. Okay, because Wizards of the Coast has made between 4 and 6 Dungeon Master Guides. They should be experts by now on how to make a Dungeon Master Guide. Experts. How many Dungeon Master Guides have they made? Well, they made a Dungeon Master Guide for version 3 of the game, okay, when they first got the Dungeons & Dragons property. When they updated version 3 to 3.5, they put out another Dungeon Master Guide. There was another opportunity to do something with it, okay. So they have made 2. When Dungeons & Dragons 4e came out, they put out 2 Dungeon Master Guides. The first one was actually not a bad book. It was pretty good for its time. It could have been better. I'm sure that there'll be people who would say it could have been better. And they put out a second book for Dungeons & Dragons 4e, another Dungeon Master Guide, the Dungeon Master Guide 2. And that was really to sort of correct some of the things they felt they hadn't done very well, or had made mistakes with, or needed to be updated or added to. And I think that's a good thing. I think that, looking at the product as something that needs to change over time is important. They've also, surprisingly, wasn't just Dungeons and Dragons 4E. There was a version of 4E called D&D Essentials, and they put out, I'm pretty sure, a Dungeon Master Guide for D&D 4E Essentials, which was slightly different again. It was supposed to be the break-in game, the simpler game for people to play. Okay, so those are the things that they have made, and now they have made the 5th edition Dungeon Master Guide. So they have had 6 opportunities to get this right and to update it, because Dungeon Master Guides can't stay the same all the time. They do need to change and morph and adjust over time. So when it comes to Wizards of the Coast making a Dungeon Master Guide that does a good job, they should be at that point that they can do that successfully, because third-party publishers have done this. There are better books out there than this book. Why? I don't know why there should be. They should be doing this right. Okay, so the Dungeon Master Guide is just not desirable enough as a book, and you could essentially pick up older Dungeon Master Guides and access the free online Dungeon Master Guide that Wizards of the Coast has produced. It's not complete, there's not everything there, but there's a lot of tools there that you can use without having to go and buy this book. You can also access a huge number of online resources for the mechanics of the game now. Now, that wasn't there when they first put out the Dungeon Master Guide, but there were a lot of stuff that were generic enough that you could transfer over to your own game, and general advice around being a Dungeon Master, building worlds. That's all been there before, how to operate at a table and manage a table, how to deal with different player styles, how to do a lot of different things that are transferable to Dungeons and Dragons 5e. Now that 6-7 years have passed, there's even more resources. Okay, so there is probably more information on the internet in older Dungeon Master guides that assist you in being a Dungeon Master than there is in this book. So I need to actually be specific with you about what those are. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless, right? We're just talking about something and giving it a hard time without giving you an actual reason why there are problems. So let's start off with the first part, and that is there's a section on types of players. There are many different types of players, and most players are made up of a combination of these, not just one type. It's not like all players are actors or instigators or thinkers or watchers, or there's a couple of different types of player, okay, and how they operate at the table, the sorts of things they like, the sorts of things you shouldn't do at the table, because it plays to some of the bad habits and poor social graces and behaviors that you do not want to encourage at your table. This is the sort of information that's very important. There's also play style. A play style is another huge factor. It is one of the most common things that people want answered. And in this book, it is extremely small and it's incomplete. Now, how do I know this? Because I looked in the Dungeon Master Guide for 4E and for 4E, the second one. I also had a look in in the 3.5. Now, I didn't look at every single Dungeon Master Guide that's ever been made, okay, but I looked at a few to see if they had done it better in the past, and they have. So for me, that section is a letdown. Now, why would that be so important in your game? Well, let's think about the fact that, one, it's probably the most common question that dungeon masters have when they're trying to run their game, but player style is very important because it covers the complex human behavior and psychological motivations for actually playing the game and why people play the game the way they play it. Those are the sorts of things that people do need to understand. This is next level stuff. It's useful for beginners, it's useful for intermediate, and we would like to think as experienced dungeon masters, if you feel you are there yet, that we have a good grasp of how that works. And because not every table consists of exactly the same type of player. You've usually got a mix. And when you have a mix, you have to be able to figure out how to sort of satisfy everybody a little bit. Not completely, but a little bit. And this is poorly constructed in this book, unfortunately. Okay, what about something like the section on world building, cities, towns, settlements? That section, this thing has been done before. It has been done to death. I almost feel like people have gone and copied huge sections out of old Dungeon Master guides and transferred it into the Dungeon Master Guide for 5e. Literally, when I was looking at some of the Dungeon Master guides, it almost felt like it was word for word, structure for structure. They have made some alterations. Clearly, they didn't want to sort of plagiarize themselves. Not that you can. But that is a problem. You do have to advance things. You can't just do the same thing. If you're going to just do the same thing, you better make sure that you got it right the first time. And if you got it right the first time, don't cut back on it because of space. That is a silly thing to do. There's a lot to be said for providing things like generic area maps that people can copy and put into their game. Because, if you're building a world, often maps are a big factor. Not every Dungeon Master is very good at doing that. And yes, there are resources online that allow you to make your own, but there are some very generic things that you can put together that people will find useful in their game, and including them is a good idea. And certainly including area maps would have been a great idea. Also, presenting your Dungeon Master in this book with something like some random name generators for towns, cities, taverns in particular, because we were always looking for a tavern generator. Now, I know people are going to say, Fred, there is a tavern name generator in the book. It's very small. It's very, very small. Okay? This has been done better in other books. So why is there only 20? You roll a d20. Look, there's a reason why we have a percentile dice. Roll those 2 dice, 20 options. No, 100 options. 100 options. That's a real tool. That's competing with the online tools that are available. You can't make charts and tables unless there's really only a few options available in a particular factor or a particular area. You can't make tables that small, not with online tools. Otherwise, you become obsolete. Let's go with the word obsolete, because somebody else is going to go somewhere else and use a phone app or something online. So you have to make your charts much bigger, and that is one area you can do with names of taverns, inns, and shops. That should have been there. That should have been included. What about the fact that creating a campaign doesn't have a flow chart? That would have been really helpful, because that section's quite advanced. It's a little bit confusing. It's a bit hard to follow at times. And you know what's the shame about that section on campaign building? It's actually very in-depth. It's actually a pretty good section. They've actually done a pretty good job of it. But it's hard to follow. And when things are hard to follow, people don't use those tools. They go somewhere else. And it is a shame that people overlook this section. I overlook it constantly. Okay? And yet it is a good section, but it needed a bit more to help people understand what they were doing. And I think that excluding some of the colourful art and pictures in there and putting in a flow chart about how this system of building a campaign with the charts and the information that is provided on each of the chart sections is going to work for you. That would have made a huge difference. Okay, now Multiverse. There is the Multiverse section. I always considered it just an information dump. It's full of information. That's it. It's not really showing you and explaining to you how to build your own multiverse or series of worlds. It's really just providing you a sample of theirs. The Dungeons and Dragons design team, the Wizards of the Coast have done their thing and they've put it out. There's the information, I mean, we can have that in another book. We've already got it in books, and yet we're just presenting it again. And I'm not happy with the fact that they haven't really included. Again, this is a place where instead of pretty art, we should have had maps. There should have been maps and structures to show you how these things work. Now, there's one picture that covers that. And so they get a big thumbs up for doing that. That's a good thing, okay? But the fact is, there is too much stuff there that is just explaining the universe rather than how to do it yourself. And that is, again, a lost opportunity. Okay. There seems to be an awful lot of negative stuff, so I imagine people are running for the hills. But bear with me, okay? Because there's a reason why so few people are using the Dungeon Master Guide. And I want to point out the reasons why. What about the adventure design information? What I noticed about the adventure design information in this book and that section is it's very general. It has some good stuff amongst some very boring bits and pieces or very generic stuff that most people aren't really interested in. Now, while it's good to have random adventure creation tables, these tables, again, are very small. They're sparse on detail. They're quite generic in nature or broad. And when you put them together, you wind up with something that's quite cryptic. So now you have been given a tool that creates something that still really isn't that useful to you, and the Dungeon Master still needs to do a lot of additional work to figure out what that campaign or adventure is going to look like. And that is an odd thing to do. When you are wanting to build an adventure, there needs to be specifics. Now, there is stuff there. Okay, there are roll a d20. Again, should be percentile dice. There should be 100 options, not 20 options. There should be a lot more there. And it shouldn't be quite so generic and cryptic that it's hard to put together. Now, the other problem with having random tables, and you don't have to use those random tables as they are, you don't have to roll a dice. You could just select the things you want. Dungeon Masters don't build adventures randomly. They don't just pick up dice usually and just start rolling that d20 and just looking at what they roll on the dice and then looking at the chart. That is quite an unusual way to do adventure creation for a Dungeon Master. I'm sure there are some people out there and that is how they do it. But I would imagine that if you're dealing with a group of players and they have a particular way they want to play and a particular type of campaign they would like to play in, and you are a Dungeon Master who wants to run a particular type of campaign, and that's usually the case, everybody has their preferences and you're not going to do it randomly. Okay? But you don't have to use the random tables. You can just select them. So when you look at that section and you say, well, yeah, do I need to worry about doing that? Is there a better tool online? There probably is a better tool online. Is there a better Dungeon Master doing the Dungeon Master Guide doing this? Yes, there probably is. In fact, I know there is. So there's a whole bunch of problems. But when you see charts that require you to roll a d20 and you're put off by that, don't get put off by the fact that there's a random chart, because random charts just mean there's 20 options that you can pick. You can pick whatever you like. Okay. One of the areas in this adventure, one of the things in this book that I spent the most time on, because I had struggled with it the most out of everything else, and I imagine that everybody else is probably exactly the same and in the same boat, unless they decided not even to bother with it. And that is, what about the combat encounter building? You know, when you build a combat encounter, the guidelines around that, things like the adventuring day guidelines they provide you with, they've turned it into a mathematical formula, and this is a repeat of historical things that Wizards of the Coast has done in the past. It's been nonsensical junk since version 3, and it's been carried on to version 4, and we now got it in 5e, and I know there are people out there who will be adamant that the combat encounter creation guidelines do work, and it's just a matter of people not understanding how to do that, not being smart enough to understand how to do it, not enough experience. And there's a tiny fraction of our community who use it, and the rest of us don't touch it. And the adventuring day, almost nobody, and I've done polls on this, nobody uses the adventuring day. There's so few people using the guidelines around the adventuring day of 6 to 8 combat encounters. Okay, even if you adjust it for deadly encounters, it doesn't matter. Players don't play that way. Dungeon masters don't set up their adventures that way. Okay, should they? Well, probably not, because remember, Dungeons and Dragons is a tabletop game, and video games, this is video game stuff here. Video games are based on Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, the tabletop game, is not based on video games. Let's not go backwards on this. So there is a big problem. So if you're coming to that section, if you were to even use that, it is so complicated. I always struggle to understand how to make it work. It's one of the reasons why I've never done a video specifically on how to actually calculate combat encounters using the Dungeon Master's Guide, because it's so complicated. I know that Andrew Armstrong from Dawnforge Cast, who now no longer does videos, I think his channel has been just deleted, it's gone as far as I know, he did a video trying to explain it. But if you're going to do that, everybody's going to go and use a phone app that helps calculate it because it's so complicated to figure out, or they're going to go and use online tool Kobold Fight Club. Kobold Fight Club. Why would you do it any other way? Okay? So I still feel that even if you use something like Kobold Fight Club, it's not particularly useful. It's like a very rough guide, and much of the time it's not going to actually work that well. So it's a throwback to what they've done before. And why do they do that? They do that because you've got to understand that Wizards of the Coast is selling multiple media concepts. You have video games, you have board games, and you have the tabletop game, okay? And I'm sure there will be a card game that's Dungeons and Dragons in the future. I'm sure that will come. It probably already has come. We've probably got some version of that already. So when you've got that kind of mix going on, you always want to have something that can be presented as being a mathematical equation that you can just plug in to help programmers with their software, to help game designers design a board game. And because we are tied into the concept that everything should be fair, we're trying to create what's called balance. And this is why we have that section there. And there are plenty of people who are dungeon masters who want balance in their game. And so therefore, I understand why Wizards of the Coast does put that there, because there are people who need it. Game designers who are making software, video games need that sort of stuff. And also on top of that, there are the dungeon masters who want to have quite a high level of control. Now, what I would say is it would have been smarter for the Wizards of the Coast design team to have provided us with a link in the book or a code that we could open up that gave us access to their original spreadsheet, because they had a spreadsheet that helped calculate all this stuff themselves. Okay? Calculating challenge rating for monsters. They had a spreadsheet. It's quite a complicated process. And you can't just give somebody a bunch of guidelines because it is that complicated. And this would have been the perfect time to actually include an online tool to assist with that. All right, let's going to move off that, and we're going to move on to the next section. Creating non-player characters. I think this is the one thing that I do the most. When I think about what I do in terms of adventure design, there are a couple of things. That's usually location and maps and the selection of monsters, but NPCs is a huge area. And it's funny that I was looking at the book and I was thinking, okay, so we're talking about non-player characters and creating them, and they've got a section on it, and it's 7 pages long. 7 pages. Let's think about the number of videos that I've done on non-player characters for the Lost Mine of Phandelver. There's a lot, and they're pretty popular. People like them. People like those sorts of things. People like lore on monsters. They like lore on specific characters within the Dungeons and Dragons world. So non-player characters play a huge part. But that section's just not broad enough. There's just not enough there. Where is the name generator? Now, if you go online, you can find many name generators. But a percentile chart, 1 to 100. And I've seen it done in books before. I've talked about books that actually have this in there. Okay? For the first name, the second name, what they look like, these sorts of things have been done before. So you can make them, and they would work well, and people would use them. There needed to be a percentile chart in there. That would have made all the difference for me in terms of the non-player character section. Now, does that mean that everything in that section is a waste of time? Well, no. There is some stuff there, but you probably won't use it unless you're a beginner dungeon master. If you're experienced dungeon masters or even intermediate level, you're probably not going to use this because you've done that before. They've really only given you the bare basics, So, and you'll know there are tools somewhere else that you can use other than this section. One of the biggest beefs that I've heard people talk about, and I feel the same way, and that is under the non-player character creation stuff, there is a section on villains, okay? And I have no problem with one of the charts in there on villains. I actually think it's nice and broad, it's extensive, it gives you a lot of coverage, it does a pretty good job. What I am confused by is why are there character subclasses or options in the Dungeon Master Guide other than to broaden the consumer appeal to people who aren't Dungeon Masters. In other words, to put 2 subclasses in there that would appeal to players, not Dungeon Masters. Well, I think that's money. I think that is to try to... This is the problem with a Dungeon Master Guide. It is usually only ever purchased by Dungeon Masters. So the number of people buying a Dungeon Master Guide is very small. The number of people buying a player's handbook is extremely extensive. A lot of people buy that. You've got players and Dungeon Masters. Monster manuals, surprisingly, players like buying monster manuals. They want to have them there because they want to polymorph into creatures. They want to transform if they're a druid. They want to have animal companions. And those things are in the monster manual. So they buy that, and they don't see that as a waste of their time because it also has information on the monsters that they probably shouldn't have, but they like to have. And it's been my experience that many players often have the monster manual and the player's handbook. They have those 2 books. And if they have plenty of money and they are not short on cash, they will buy a Dungeon Master Guide if it's got player character options in it. And this one does. I don't for a minute believe that the Cleric Death Domain or the Paladin Oathbreaker was intended as only intended as a Dungeon Master's villainous mechanical features section. I don't think that was the case. I think there was very much an intention to make that optional, certainly, but there as something that players would go and see Dungeon Masters about and say, can I play this? I know it's a villain feature in the Dungeon Master Guide, but I would like to play, the Death Domain. I would like to have an Oathbreaker. Now, my personal experience is that there are people in the games that I have run who've come to me and said, I would like to play the Death Domain Cleric. And before I can speak up and say anything, there's usually somebody within the group who says, actually, that is actually a villain option. It's not a player option. It's not a player option, it's a villain option. It's something that Dungeon Masters use for their NPCs. And then the players are like, oh I don't understand that. Why? I thought that was there for me. Okay, this has happened to me a few times. Nobody so far has played a Death Domain Cleric in my game, but I have had people ask me on multiple occasions. I have had somebody ask me on multiple occasions to play an Oathbreaker, and I have had multiple Oathbreakers in my games because, one of the things is persistence beats resistance. So if a player's persistence continues, eventually a Dungeon Master's resistance will get broken down, and you'll wind up doing it. And this is what happened to me. Now, am I terribly worried about that? No. I'm happy for players to play other things, but that section there was never really put there for me as a Dungeon Master. It was really put there for players so that they would buy the Dungeon Master Guide, and that's a horrible little trick. Certainly it's good for marketing, good for profit, but it is a horrible, nasty trick as far as I'm concerned. And Wizards of the Coast, for doing a horrible, nasty trick on Dungeon Masters, really, and to players, you get a big thumbs down for that. Okay, I understand why a lot of people get upset about that section. Okay, let's talk about the token gesture of traps and sample traps. Look, I looked through all of the Dungeon Master guides that were ever put out by Wizards of the Coast, and compared to the past publications, and this annoys me a lot, there's about a third of what you could have had in the book. Only a third of the types of traps they've presented in older versions, that's version 3 and 4, are presented in this book. Hence, as a result, we wind up with traps in a supplement years later. I don't like that. I want the traps in the Dungeon Master Guide so that they're all in one place and easy to find. Okay? I would also like to have, and yes, there is a section on how to build your own types of traps. Okay? That is there. There is a couple of very small charts, very simple, very easy to follow, that actually give you some reasonable sort of guidelines around how to do that. And I know that some Dungeon Masters use that, but it wasn't really enough. We needed just a little bit more. But those two sections, you can, if you are an intermediate to experienced Dungeon Master, that's probably all you need, and you can do the rest yourself. Okay? But if you're not that experienced, you would struggle. And if you're an experienced Dungeon Master, you will fall back on older Dungeon Master guides. This is what I do. A lot of the videos I make on this channel are not made from content in the Dungeon Master Guide for 5e. They are made from content from my past experience, research I do on the internet, the past experience of Dungeon Masters that I know, and from older Dungeon Master guides. And a vast amount of the content on my channel is coming from, would you believe it, the 4E Dungeon Master Guide, both of them. There's two of them. And that's where that content's coming from. So if you wanted to know where it all came from, those are the areas that it comes from. It's not coming from the 5e Dungeon Master Guide, because it's just not detailed enough to give you what you need. Okay. Right, let's have a look at Downtime. Now, Downtime is one of those things, when I looked at Downtime, I thought, wow, it is something that we overlook as Dungeon Masters. So the Dungeon Master activities are exceptional content. Okay, Wizards of the Coast needs to get a A+ for exceptional content here. But it could have been more in depth and broader. It really could have been. It has covered sort of the basic things that most players want to do, but there are still other things they could have added. And they have put out a supplement that does exactly that, okay? Here's the problem with Downtime, is that few Dungeon Masters will realize the full potential of this section, unfortunately. It is probably very rare that you'll get a Dungeon Master who includes good chunks of downtime to allow people downtime activities rather than just going from one adventure to the next adventure and keeping the flow going. I'm sure there'll be Dungeon Masters who do use downtime. Okay, I use now between 2 and 4 weeks of downtime between every adventure. So none of the adventures are strung together too tightly, if I can help it. That's how I would prefer it to work. That gives the players time to do their own thing and feel like they are in command of their own world to a certain degree. Because they can't be controlling everything. They can only really control their character, but we want them to be able to do something with their character that's unique to everybody else. And this is not a modern concept whether you realise it or not. It's not a modern concept at all. But the concept behind having downtime activities spelled out in a Dungeon Master Guide, when I was looking at that, I was like, well, they actually did a better job here than they have done in the past, but they could have done a better job than what they did, because that's why we wound up with more downtime activities put out in a supplement later on. So a lost opportunity, and it is one part of the Dungeon Master Guide that unfortunately Dungeon Masters don't utilise enough, and I think that is a shame because it's a good section. Okay, let's talk about the amount of space used for magic items being quite outrageous. Now, stay with me. I know people are going to get upset, but let me explain, because it's a complicated section, okay? The rationales behind what's going on here, and also the usability and why it's there. It's very, very important to go through all those bits and pieces, because you have to put perspective in place. The amount of space used for the magic items might be outrageous. It's almost a third of the book. Now, why is it done? For the sake of trying to get players to buy the book and improve sales of the DMG, because, as I said, players don't buy the Dungeon Master Guide unless there's something in it that they want. And players want races, feats, character options, classes, subclasses, and magic items is like the crack or drug for players. It is the thing that they want the most. So if you put it in a Dungeon Master Guide, you'd be guaranteed that pretty much players will buy this thing. There's a large magic item section in the Dungeon Master Guide, and it has been done before. I would like to point out, before people start saying, yeah, they shouldn't have done that. Well, actually, version 3.5, the Dungeon Master Guide, had quite an extensive section in there on magic items, and that section was probably about either only fractionally smaller than the one that we have in the current Dungeon Master Guide, or it was about the same. So this is not new. This is not something new that we have seen from Wizards of the Coast, okay? So, what's funny about this is that magic items turn out to be the most used section by Dungeon Masters as a reference tool. Why is that? Well, there's actually many different reasons why Dungeon Masters use the magic item section more than any other section in the entire book, and why they reference it during their games, and why they do so before a game. And I will explain that. But before we unpack that, let's talk about the fact that there is a rationale that if you put magic items in a Dungeon Master Guide, players will buy it. So one of the things I found interesting is some of the players that had lots of money that were playing in my group, they would buy the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. Okay, why did they buy the Dungeon Master's Guide? They bought the Dungeon Master's Guide primarily for the magic items. And then they would say to me, I feel kind of annoyed that I've bought a book and it has magic items in it, but it's only a third of the book. I wanted a book that just had magic items in it. I would have bought that. Do you know, that's the thing, is that Dungeon Masters and players, if there was just a book of magic items, they would buy it. They would just buy it. It wouldn't be a problem. It would be because it is the D&D crack or drug of our games nowadays, people would buy it and it would be a bestseller. You'd be guaranteed it'd be sold out. I'm sure of that. Now, there have been books put out that just had magic items in them, and the sales for those have been a bit hard to determine, a little bit spotty sometimes, but that's usually because they tried to put out too many magic item books. If you put out one, you're done, and that's a good thing. And then anything else is just additional specific stuff to an adventure or a campaign. It's when you try to have a line or series of magic item books that you put out, that's when you run into problems. But if you just have one, that's a good thing. All right. So again, I would say that Wizards of the Coast has not covered things here that they haven't done before. Okay, they've done it before, but they do get a thumbs down for one, not really giving players what they wanted. They only gave them a third of what they wanted, and they'll wind up with a whole lot of content that they'll never use. The hope is, though, and this is my hope, is that those players who haven't dungeon mastered but just wanted the magic items in there will one day pick up the mantle and be a dungeon master. We can only hope. We can only hope. Okay. Now, let's talk about the fact that there are different reasons why Dungeon Masters use the Dungeon Master Guide, and that the section on magic items is the most used section. Why is that? Is that because Dungeon Masters really wanted to have magic items in the Dungeon Master's Guide? It may be. Is it because that it is probably the most searched section during a game, because when you're planning out your game or you get a pre-written adventure, they don't give you all the information on the magic item. They just reference the magic item, and then you have to go and look in the Dungeon Master's Guide, right? So if you're running a pre-made adventure and you come across a magic item, the Dungeon Master Guide probably just makes an entry in their notes of, this is the item, the name of the item, and the page number and the DMG, and they just look it up. Or they get the players to look it up if they have their own Dungeon Master Guide, which they quite well might have. So that is probably why it is the most referenced section in the book, just for that fact. It is not something you want to write out onto a card or put into a document all the time. It would be easier just to reference the page and then go to the book. What about your own homebrew games? Well, again, same thing. It is much easier in a homebrew game where it's not pre-written and it's not published by somebody else to just reference a page number in the DMG. So that's probably why it is the most utilized section by Dungeon Masters. As far as I can tell from the poll, it seems to be fundamentally used more often than anything else by Dungeon Masters. So let's not beat up on that section too much. But let's have a chat, though, about the fact that if you want to build magic items, that's a different story. That gets a bit more complicated. I'm going to get back to that particular topic. Not just yet. Just give me a bit of time, because there's more to discuss. Okay, what about guidance around skill challenges? Not so much used in Dungeons & Dragons 5e, but at least skill check trees. I mean, how they would work. Some guidance around that would have been really helpful. And there's a little bit of information there, but not a lot. But one of the biggest problems that Dungeon Masters strike is skill check difficulty class. What is the DC for a skill check? Now, we've given a scale of 5 to 30, and it's all very well saying, okay, 5 is very easy and 30 is near impossible. But if you don't have anything to actually reference it against, it's kind of hard to figure out what should be 5 and what should be 30, depending on the skill that you're using. Okay, it is almost non-existent within this book. There are splatterings scattered throughout the entire book where you might have to do a check for a social interaction, whether that be a persuasion, intimidation, or a deception check. There are bits and pieces in there with DCs, so don't get me wrong, there are some. There's some stuff around foraging in the wilderness. There's a couple of others there in terms of, I believe it's a listening at a door, I think that's right. But it's not enough. It doesn't cover enough for what a Dungeon Master will need, which is something that Dungeon Masters always ask about. I find Dungeon Masters constantly asking this question, and also it's something they need. And it's not in the Player's Handbook, and it's not in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I would like to point out that the 4E Dungeon Master Guide does have that sort of thing in there. And would you believe it? I was thinking, oh, maybe it was just 4E where they did it. Maybe that's the time. But no. I went back, 3.5 had a big table going through the different DCs for different types of skills and what they sort of would look like. You know, what would be a 5, 10, 15, 20 for this particular thing you were trying to do. And it covered a variety of different skills. I would not say it covered everything, but the ones you were most likely to use. Okay? Perception was there, stealth was there, things like, what was it? checks for, charisma, they were there. Those things were there. And it was in one place on a big table. So it was easy to find and easy to reference. And we didn't get it in this book. Why did we not get that when they did such a good job in the past of making that work? That's a shame. A lost opportunity again. This book was meant to have a large range of optional rules that dungeon masters could use. So these are variant rules, but there's only a handful of variant rules in the book. And you might have noticed that when you're reading through these variant rules, they really don't go over the pros and cons of using that variant rule. Now, why is that? I think it's probably because they were never play tested, so they didn't have any reference point for what they would do in the game and how they would affect the game. Now, would it be reasonable for Wizards of the Coast to provide their variant rules for your game? Now, the design process was about 2.5 years, and we're looking at trying to have variant rules that really need to be tested after the full-fledged core rules have been put together and you have finished the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual. So once the Monster Manual's done and your player handbook's done, then you can start testing variant rules. It was probably a bad idea for Wizards of the Coast to say that we're going to offer you a large variety of variant rules in this book, and you'll find them useful, because they're not going to be play tested. It would be unreasonable to expect Wizards of the Coast to be able to play test these things so that you have an idea of how they're going to work. It would be impossible to really. You could only speculate at the pros and cons of how those variant rules would work in your game, because they hadn't really had the full-fledged game complete to test it against. So when you start saying things like, well, there's just not enough meat around the optional rules and the variant rules, yeah, they probably should not have said that's what's going to be in the book. And they probably should not have played that up as much as they did. And yes, they're not usually going to be hugely useful, because you've got to do all the play testing to see if they're any good for you in your game. So we're not going to give Wizards of the Coast a hard time about something that probably would have taken them another 2.5 years to test. Okay. Here's something that we do need to talk about, and this is something that people trawl the internet for on YouTube in particular, and that is, there is really no solutions offered for dealing with difficult problem players or dungeon masters' behavior. There's nothing there. Yet it's been seen in older Dungeon Master guides. There's really nothing there for you. If you needed advice around how to deal with somebody who's who's essentially the rules lawyer, somebody who's disruptive, and sort of some options and guidelines about what you could do or what might help you at the game table, those aren't provided in this Dungeon Master guide. So that's strange, isn't it? Because you would think that would be something that Dungeon Masters would need, and yet it's not in this book. No, Wizards of the Coast, you don't get points for doing that sort of thing. Now, I know they're trying to have more of a hands-off approach with 5e, but really they haven't had a hands-off approach. They've put their hands on there pretty good. Okay, they've got their hands on there pretty tight. So we can't say that they got a hands-off approach. They just dropped the ball. I think they just ran out of space. Essentially, I think they decided, well, we've got to cut something, and we'll cut that. And that was the wrong decision, in my opinion. A frequently asked question around character death. Now, character death is asked about constantly, and it has been omitted from this particular Dungeon Master Guide. It was included in past Dungeon Master Guides. And the thing with character death is it is quite often an emotionally charged major event for some players. Not all players. Some players are just like, okay, I move on. Character died. If I can raise the character, great. If I can't, I'll make a new character. Move on. I don't care. It's all good. And there are other players who are not going to respond well to character death. And we used to have guidance around that, and yet there's nothing in this book. And it's such a frequently asked question. There's a reason why I have 3 videos on TPKs, Total Party Kills, on my channel. There's a reason why I've probably done about 4 videos on character death on my channel, because there was nothing ever on YouTube, and the ones that you got were really just not that helpful. And they should have had it in this book. They should have done something there. Okay? So let's talk about, I need a drink of water, but creating stuff from scratch. You know what I think that is great about anything in any tool book, and this is what a Dungeon Master's Guide is it's a tool book, is the ability to create monsters, spells, magic items, races, classes, backgrounds, because backgrounds are used in Dungeons & Dragons 5e. This is a significant development in Dungeon Master tools. But here's the problem. It's poorly executed in this book. It's actually poorly executed in this book. And the funny thing is that past Dungeon Master Guides, the 4e Dungeon Master Guide, for example, there was poor execution in that book, and they've carried that over to this book. You would have thought they'd have learned their lesson this time round. Now, there are certain things in terms of creating stuff in your Dungeons & Dragons game that they did well. So they covered monsters. The creation of monsters is done exceptionally well. It actually is very, very good. And I would say that for me, I was relatively happy with some of the monster stuff. So the monster features, that section, there's a big couple of pages of just monster features that they've pulled from the monster manual and just put into 2 pages in the DMG. That's really helpful. You don't have to flip through an entire book to find all the things that you've got them all there, and you can just sort of what works with the monster I'm creating. So that's excellent job. The monster quick build chart. That monster quick build chart, I've used that so many times. I found that really useful. I wouldn't say that the challenge rating calculation part of it has been helpful. I would just ignore that, but everything else has been really, really good. They have an excellent section on magic item special features, the past history of magic items, quirks, the different types of properties that magic items. They have tables for them. They're inspiring. They are excellent, but they're not extensive enough. And what's also frustrating is they're scattered throughout the book. There's actually 2 locations they sit in. They sit in the section on creating magic items, and they also sit, those tables should have been in a different place, they also sit in part of the section on magic items. Why did they do that? I don't understand. Stick all of the stuff around creating magic items in one place, so it's easy to find and reference. It used to constantly confuse me. I'm like, why can't I find? I know there's a chart that gives me detrimental effects, minor and major, and I can't find that chart. And then where's the other charts? Because they're in 2 different locations. That's confusing. So you don't get points for doing that. That could have been put together, and it would have made magic item creation excellent and monster creation brilliant. Monster creation is pretty good. That's my opinion anyway. With regard to things like spells and races, classes, backgrounds, I don't think they gave you enough. I think they did really well with 2 areas and they dropped the ball on the others. That's my opinion. And yes, as I said, monster challenge rating calculations, adjustments, and formulas I always find completely pointless. So I don't give them any points for that. So let's talk now. We're up to the index at this point. The index has some pretty solid tools. Why is the appendix? The appendix has some really solid tools. There is a random dungeon table, a series of them. There's not just one. There's many that build on top of each other to do everything that you really want. There are lists of monsters by environment, which I know a lot of people believe should be in the monster manual. There's a list of monsters by challenge rating, which is incredibly useful too, and a lot of people believe it should be in the monster manual. I don't really mind. I'm quite happy for it to be in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's just, the problem is, trying not to forget that they exist because it's very easy to forget that they are there and that you can use them. And I think a lot of Dungeon Masters fall into that trap. There is a section on Dungeon Master inspirational book reading, and so there's a list of books you could read to get inspiration as a Dungeon Master. Those are good sections. Okay, for those of you who are thinking, no, he had bad things to say. No, those are actually really good sections. Now, here's a problem, though, with random dungeon generated tables. And the reason there is a little bit of a problem with them is that Dungeon Masters don't build dungeons randomly, usually. It's very rare that you get somebody who builds them in a random nature. They usually want to build on real-world architecture, rather than just make something that's just sort of, random. It doesn't seem to have any logical sense to it. But it is a comprehensive list that even if you don't use it as a table and roll dice for it, it is a pretty comprehensive list of locations, I found. And even traps, furniture, and decorations that you can put into the different chambers and rooms or locations that you're building. So I actually see there's quite a lot of value in that. It would have been smart to include more specific historical descriptions of the different dungeon rooms listed in the random room tables. So what do I mean? I mean, if you're coming to a gallery, giving some person who's a dungeon master an idea of what a gallery looks like. They don't have to do read aloud text, but a basic idea, a paragraph or a couple of sentences would have been really helpful to give you an idea of what that's like. If you come to a torture chamber, what would you find in a torture chamber? And how would it look? That would be really useful. What its purpose would be like. Those are things that a lot of dungeon masters look up later on because it's not in the Dungeon Master Guide. Okay, I can assure you that there'll be dungeon masters who look up torture chambers and torture devices because they don't have that information in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and it would have been useful to have it there. Things like the treasure chamber in a tomb, some sort of idea of what that would be like. It doesn't have to be extensive. Barracks, what they can look like. Then you might have a barrack that has bunks, or just a series of beds, or just bedrolls, but I'm actually not being, I guess, I'm not picking the best options, I guess, in terms of my explanation for what I mean by better descriptions of those rooms. But if you give them that sort of information, I would imagine that a lot of dungeon masters would have used that section a lot more than they do now. There is a shame. It's a big shame. I thought there was a section on there that had potential. It's a shame that none of the sample maps in the appendix are what dungeon masters would generally need to use frequently, because they're not there. Things like a campsite. It's pretty simple, but just a simple campsite that you could reuse. I know a lot of dungeon masters would appreciate that, to deal with all of those random encounters or disruptions to people's short rests or long rest at night. A campsite map would have been useful. Something like taverns. Taverns, there's always a battle or a fight or a brawl in a tavern. So a map for a tavern, a shop, an inn, all would have been really useful. Those are things that dungeon masters like. Now, if you want to go the next level, then give them a castle. Give them a map of a castle. There's nothing like that really there. There is a fortress, but it's a very sort of odd-looking thing. I think actually what dungeon masters want are things that are based more on the architecture of reality rather than on some bizarre creation that somebody's pulled out of their head that doesn't really feel functional. Okay? Crypts. What does a crypt look like? Give us a map for that. A tomb. Again, much like a crypt, but useful. Mines. The structure and how a mine is laid out. I'm thinking more in terms of the layout vertically rather than horizontally. There might be a map for horizontal layout and what it would look like, because often mines are built exactly the same way over and over again for safety reasons. And that would actually have been really useful as a sample map. And then, of course, monster lairs. A monster lair sample map for a dragon. That would have been the first thing you would put down, right? You would think that would be... Those things aren't there. I like the inclusion of the boat. I thought the boat was a good inclusion because it's one of those things that a lot of people sort of struggle with, but it's probably not detailed enough to be useful to you. So I think they could have done a little bit more of that. That's not to say that those maps can't be useful, but I've never used them myself. And I would be quite surprised if anybody has actually used them themselves. There's probably only a few people who have. Okay, let's talk about the... So we're trying to be honest and blunt about this, okay? We need to get to the facts. Let's talk about the fact that they have an index in this book. There is a reasonable index for finding information in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It is actually quite rare for Wizards of the Coast to put an index into their Dungeons & Dragons 5e books. And I am glad they have done it with the Dungeon Master's Guide, because it would have made life very, very difficult. The problem is, it is still quite difficult to find specific information, even if you use the index and the contents page in conjunction with each other. There are some sections that are so small in the Dungeon Master's Guide that you would have to trawl through them for a very long time to find that section that you're looking for, or to even find if they've got a section on something. So, yes, good, they've got an index. Could the book have been laid out better to make it easier to find stuff? And I think they're probably, I think that is part of the problem in terms of how they have laid out some of the information. Some of it seems to be in the right place and some of it seems to be a little bit scattered. Or some of the sections are so small that they're probably not going to show up on your radar, and so they'll get missed. Even if it's a golden nugget that would make a big difference in your game, you're probably going to miss it because you just won't be able to find it. Let's talk about art. Because all books produced by Wizards of the Coast have put out some pretty good artwork. The Dungeon Master Guide has a lot of very pretty artistic pictures. Now, if I was looking at a player's handbook and I saw art in there, if it's relevant to the section, I'm happy. I like the idea with the player character stuff that there are images of what those kinds of classes look like. That's good. I think it's good that if you have a monster manual, you have a monster picture as well for each of the monsters. That is definitely a want. With a Dungeon Master Guide, it's a little bit different, okay? Because you have to think about, is it adding value to the book by putting in pretty pictures of stuff in a Dungeon Master Guide? What sort of art needs to be in there? And let's get real. Many of the books put out by Wizards of the Coast or Dungeon Master Guides in the past have always tended to focus on pretty pictures or no pictures and just a lot of text. So what would you put there in terms of an illustration or a bit of artwork to break up the text and make it still useful for Dungeon Masters? And you know what I think it would be? Maps. Maps. I think maps make it all. Common location maps would have made a significant improvement to Dungeon Master usage. I think it would have improved the fact that Dungeon Masters would use those maps in their campaigns, whether they were homebrew or pre-written. They would have plucked them and used them where they needed to. And we don't have that. Instead, we have a lot of artwork. So where would you have put those maps if you decided maps were a better idea than something like a picture of a different plane of existence? What would you put in there? And where would you put it? Well, there are lots of different things you could put in there, but the contents page would tell you everything, I would say. When it comes to a world of your own, that's creating your world. That's where you would put a whole bunch of maps around towns, settlements, stuff like that, inns, taverns. That's a good place to stick that sort of thing. Even in maps of continents. to help people understand. Those are the types of artwork that should have been there. Maps, continents, okay, adventure maps on small locations, towns, cities. Those would have been the things to put there. And you can go down to a more micro version of, getting in a bit closer if you want to. The multiverse, another place where actually pretty pictures not so useful, but maps would have been quite useful, because it often they don't get mapped, but at least a sample map to give you an idea of what it sort of looks like. Yeah. The area on creating adventures, absolutely another good place to put maps. You wouldn't want to put them in the non-player character section. This is where you want pictures of villains and non-player characters that you would use in your game, and they've done that. Okay. The section on adventure environment, again, a good opportunity either to present a picture of the type of environment they're exploring, and I think more traps, what a trap would look like. I think diagrams of how traps are actually constructed, they actually do exist on the internet. People actually do look this up, and they look for how does a trap work. I mean, how does a dart trap from a wall function? And then you get a diagram and it shows you how they constructed them in the past. How does a snare trap work? How does a pit trap operate and work? These are things that you would put into there. So diagrams for that. Between adventures, so downtime activities. Not necessarily something that you want to have a map in, but if you are building a stronghold, then maps on some of those strongholds would be useful. This is a place where you would want to put in something like their house that they live in. The guild a guild map would have been, a map of the guild hall, or a castle or a fortress or something like that. Treasure. They've done a great job with the artwork in the treasure section. It should stay the way it is. They've got a lot of different images there, and they work and help you understand what those magic items kind of look like, and that's great. Running the game. Running the game is a little bit complicated. They do actually have diagrams of how battle and combat works on a grid and hex mats, hex grid and stuff like that. So that's all pretty good. But yes, one of the big things that you want to do if you're going to improve this book and future books is you've got to include more maps for Dungeon Masters to pillage, steal, and borrow. Okay? All right. Moving on. So the only reason that I could think of to have this book rather than an older Dungeon Master guide is really for the magic items, because they are specific to Dungeons & Dragons 5e, the variant rules, and the Dungeons & Dragons 5e specific mechanics. There are a series of mechanics within there that are very specific to Dungeons & Dragons 5e, such as traps, madness, disease, and there are other things as well. Those are the things that those are the only things that people really would want access to in this book. The rest of it has been done before. So if you've got an older Dungeon Master guide, or you've spent a lot of time on the internet and you've collected a lot of different websites that you can use, that you don't really need it. So the problem with a Dungeon Master guide, let's talk about what the problem is in our modern day, because there are some things that Wizards of the Coast are working against that are things that they probably can't solve with regard to a Dungeon Master guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5e, and eventually when we get Dungeons & Dragons 6e. It will eventually happen, but there are some problems that they face, and that is every time you make a Dungeon Master guide, or any kind of Dungeon Master guide, you must lift the quality tools bar so much higher each edition, because they become irrelevant. They're not relevant to what you're doing. And this has actually happened with this book, unfortunately. It's unfortunate. It does happen sometimes. Sometimes people just can't keep up with how things are working. This is partly due to, I would say, poor book design by the Wizards of the Coast design team. I think they have a lot of reprinted material that is very similar or almost exactly the same from older Dungeon Master guides. And they're also working against the online digital resources that are now available, which weren't available in the past. And there's so many more than there were before. it does beg the question whether a Dungeon Master Guide should be a physical book anymore, and whether it should simply be a website that is updated and produced and looked after by Wizards of the Coast or Dungeons and Dragons. I kind of think that maybe that is probably where our Dungeon Master Guide needs to go. The only problem I can see with making it only digital and not having a physical book is that this might be hard for some people to understand, but there are some countries where internet access is not actually that easy, where accessing things online is just not practical. It's too expensive. The devices that you need to actually purchase are beyond people's income. Now, if you live in a country where, everybody's quite wealthy and they can access smartphones and computers and tablets and so forth, well, that's all good. But there are people who can't. And so therefore a book tends to be a bit cheaper in terms of having a resource. And often a book can sell at a much cheaper rate once it's a bit older. So yeah, I think really the sweet spot for the Dungeon Master's Guide in the future is going to be a physical book that gets it right on the physical level, but it also has a link to a website where you get more resources that they couldn't fit in the Dungeon Master's Guide, that aren't practical to release to you in that form, because there would not be space. The book would simply be too big and too expensive. And I want to reiterate that there are a lot of tables and charts in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the vast majority of these tables are they're too small, they're quite primitive in some cases, and they're quite sparse on information. And there have been many third-party publishers who have done that a lot better than they have here. And that is unfortunate, because it shouldn't have happened that way, okay? Because they had plenty of practice. They had plenty of times to get it right. I am hoping that you found this useful. I know I have talked for a very long time, but it's an important thing to discuss, because it is probably the one thing that dungeon masters constantly are searching for on the internet, because they can't find it in their Dungeon Master's Guide. So we need to talk about the issues. So if you found this useful, fantastic. I have hundreds of videos for players and dungeon masters. Surprisingly, many videos on dungeon mastering, as it happens. If you want to support the channel so I keep doing video content like this, you can through Patreon, Amazon affiliate links down in the description. I have linked a very good book that I highly recommend, that I think you will use far more than the Dungeon Master's Guide. And guess what? That's the Game Master's Book of Random Encounters. It is full of maps. I've talked about this book before. I actually think you will find that vastly more useful to you as a Dungeon Master than the Dungeon Master's Guide, unfortunately. And you're welcome to go and check that if you want to. But there are lots of links to Amazon affiliate links down that support the channel. I have a merchandise shelf underneath all of my videos if you're interested. Otherwise, just watch my videos if you want to support the channel. That's good enough for me. And leave comments is always helpful too. I respond to the ones that are reasonable. You'll be surprised. I respond to a lot of comments. Make sure to share, like, and subscribe. All that usual YouTube stuff that you hear, right? And make sure to hit the bell button if you want to be notified when I go live. And I go live a lot every week, or publish any kind of new content. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s. Okay, so we are back, and it is time to do some Q&A and questions. And I do apologise for those of you who've had to stick around for almost an hour and a quarter to hear me talk about the Dungeon Master's Guide. I know it comes off as being like a ranting lunatic. But I thought, if I'm going to talk about the Dungeon Master's Guide, I might as well be honest and straight to the point, and I might as well make sure that you get the information you need about it, and give a bit of perspective to it. So I did a lot of research, okay? Fredo, how's it going? I'm glad you're having a good day. I need to go to the top of the The chat, I will stick around for a little while because I know I have not given you the opportunity to actually ask questions. Hashtag questions dot please. Okay, I'll put that in. Did I get it right? I'm going to have to put my eyes on. Yeah, man, the glasses are working today. Thank you. I'm glad, because I did find on the internet that everybody just seemed to have positive things to say about the Dungeon Master's Guide, but not point out some of the flaws in this book. And it's probably because they wanted to sell the book to you. Okay? I am not suggesting that you should go and buy the Dungeon Master's Guide. Okay? I am not. I really aren't. That is not my intention at all. My intention is to direct you into a different location. It's one of the reasons why you'll notice on the community tab of my channel that I have been posting links to different websites that have online tools that you can use for those of you who have ready access to the internet and can use those sorts of things. And for those of you who can't, then I have been doing other things, and I'll keep doing that. I think that's quite useful to everybody. And you'll let me know, of course, if it's not, but we'll keep trying and see if we can sort of use the community tab in a way it's never been used before. Okay, Jasper's here. What does half mean? Well, okay, yes. Okay, so Jasper wants to know what my title is. What's the deal with my title? What I'm referring to with the Dungeon Master's Guide is that the Dungeon Master's Guide is half a Dungeon Master Guide. You've got half the stuff you need, and half of it has been left out or has been overlooked. So you're not really getting the full toolbox that you needed as a Dungeon Master. So that's what I mean by half a book. Hi, Pat. Pat Sherwood is a patron. How's it going? Fendar's here. Hello, Fendar. He's also a patron. Overboard DM, that Joe has his own YouTube channel, does miniatures, terrain, reviews. You should go and check him out. We've known each other for a long time. Catherine, hello Catherine, how are you doing? I don't know if you're still here, Catherine, but if you are, welcome. John Cartwright. Hello, who likes hats? Look, it is cold here. If I was not wearing this hat, I would have to wear a beanie. It is getting quite cold in New Zealand. We're going from autumn to winter, and I really feel like winter in New Zealand is like 9 months rather than 3 months. Hence, you will have noticed that I'm now sporting the jumper, and the jumper might get thicker over time. Just give it a bit more time, and it'll get colder and colder, and I'll have no choice. Phoenix, how's it going? Phoenix Rapunzel. So far, I'm in agreement about the flaws of the Dungeon Master Guide, and talked about yeah, it's hard to use at times. Yes, and I think the problem is that too many people were impressed by some aspects of the book, and didn't really point out some of the issues with regard to this book. So okay, but we're not here to just. I mean, it's all very well agreeing with me, but that doesn't matter ultimately in the end. I guess when you watch a video like this, you're coming to see what my opinion is. Whether that's my opinion has any kind of merit whatsoever, I don't know. But maybe you can see some alignment between what you felt or think when you picked up the Dungeon Master's Guide, or if you were thinking of doing so. But my feeling is, like with almost everything, is it's all very well to take somebody's opinion, but in the end, you are reliant on your own discernment. Because most of us are adults who are playing this game, and we can draw our own opinion, and we don't need somebody else to tell us what to think. Hi, John Cartwright. What's got here? The first edition and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons DMG had lots and lots of magic items in it as well. Yes, John. I do believe they did, because I used to have the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master Guide. So, yeah, magic items being in the book shouldn't be a huge problem. I think the biggest issue with how that was organized was the fact that the creation of magic items, all the information you needed to be in one place, so it was easy to find. Overboard DM, what do you got here, Joe? I have that encounter book you recommended, Fred. It should be here tomorrow. Okay, good. I hope you got a kickback from it because I used your affiliate link to add to my cart. So as it happens, Joe, a lot of people have purchased that book. I've noticed, and I think I do think I'm steering you in the right direction. I honestly do think that you will not be disappointed by the book. Yeah. Ranger Reek. I disagree wholeheartedly. Too many people rely on the argument that older editions used X or Y. Only if there was a way for a DM to, I don't know, blah, use your imagination. Okay, Ranger Reek, we can disagree. I mean, obviously I'm not going to change your opinion of the book. And I can guarantee you, Ranger, that you won't change my opinion of the book. Okay? So obviously this was a waste of your time to watch this particular video, and I'm sad that it has been a long time, and you probably have wasted your time listening to what I had to say. Okay, moving on. What's that? Bergit Mountain? I think that's right. I apologize if I got your name wrong. Okay. I would love to play a game with in a game you are running. Yeah, it's not going to happen. I just don't have time. I struggle to keep it together just running my own home group. The reality is that I have a full-time job, 40 hours a week. It's a tough job. There is a commute time, which isn't too bad compared to what I've done in the past. I have a 2-year-old living with me now. This house gets very, very busy. And I do everything myself because I don't have a partner to. I do all my cooking, all my cleaning, and I have a YouTube channel that I run, and I try to produce more than one video a week if I can. You'd be surprised the amount, and there's just so many things going on, so I just don't have time to do that sort of thing. I know people have wanted to see my games, but I can assure you that I am nothing special. I've said this before. I'm just a guy who's played the game, sharing what I think are very obvious and simple concepts that most of the dungeon masters and players that I play with know of, and how they do things. It's not rocket science, I just sometimes I think that my perspective is from somebody who isn't a celebrity and isn't really trying to sell something specific. I don't make a Dungeons and Dragons product to sell to you. The only thing I'm selling to you, I guess, is the information in my videos. That's really about it. Darth Joel. Thank you, Darth Joel, for the super chat. Is it a super chat or is it a sticker? I think it's a super chat. Hi Fred, love your channel. I am an old returning player that played in the 80s. And okay, version 1. I've liked some of the changes over the years. Yeah, look, a lot of changes over the years needed to take place, and everything does change, and there have been some vast improvements. So yes, that's good. And I imagine there will continue to be improvements. There are times, though, that I feel like we do step backwards, but then that seems to happen with technology. You lose technology over the ages. There are things that we've lost. There are things in terms of society, things that we had that we've lost, and that's a shame. But hopefully we will get back to where we were and just keep all the good stuff. Okay, John, what do you got here? Maybe it's just me, but I don't need a chart to make a monster or a magic item. No, John, you don't need. You just do it. I think the chart concept is to make it easy to read. I mean, you don't really want to roll randomly on a chart for magic items and monsters, no matter what you get. I tend to select things. I look at it's really just a list of ideas. And if the list of ideas is big enough, that really helps. Rather than just 20 options, 100 options is much better. And for people who struggle to come up with these ideas, that would have been, I think, pretty useful. But obviously not what you required, John. Okay. Is it Canine? Canine Crusader. I use some of the stuff from the Dungeon Master's Guide, but for most of my rules, I use Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. I highly recommend the book as a DM supplement. Now, it's interesting you say that. I would actually say, when it comes to supplements that Wizards of the Coast has put out, which supplement is more useful to me? Which one have I used the most? Volo's Guide to Monsters, actually. Volo's Guide to Monsters. I know Tasha's has a lot of new stuff in there, but Tasha's Cauldron of Everything I find to be a player's handbook. The sidekick stuff and the stuff on magical environments, I think it's that. They look pretty good. The rest of it, it didn't appeal to me. I feel like it's more a toolbox for players that dungeon masters have to sign off on, rather than something I can use. So for me, it's Volo's Guide to Monsters in terms of a good supplement that Wizards of the Coast has put out for 5e. Mordenkainen's is all right. I mean, it does some things right there, but I do miss the structure and what they did with Volo's Guide to Monsters. Mordenkainen's doesn't quite hit the spot. Joan D, sorry. Ending up with a very interesting search history. Haha. Yes, you can wind up with a very interesting search history if you are looking for online tools. I think that's what you're meaning, right? Crafty Orc Guild. Do you ever use Roll20 when playing D&D, mate? No, I don't. I had somebody come and try to teach me how to use Roll20, and in the end I discovered that it would actually take me more time to prepare my game if I used Roll20. So as a result, when it comes to running combats, I use Theatre of the Mind over Zoom with my friends. I know I'm in New Zealand, and we could meet up together. That could be done, but the problem is that the risk is still too great, I think, and for the sake of just making sure that our family members are safe, and there's enough of us who have older members who would be at risk, significant risk, and I have a friend who has a health condition that makes him extremely vulnerable. We have kept it to online. So what I do is I just set up my webcam, and we do our video conference using Zoom, and I do Theatre of the Mind. I point it at my face, and when I want to run a battle that's a bit complicated, I have a battle map set up on my desk in front of me, and there's about, what would I say, about 30 by 50 centimeters. I don't know what that would be in Imperial, because I'm from New Zealand and we use metric. It's a big enough space to set up a battle map, some miniatures, use some dice, and I just turn the tripod down on my webcam and point it at the desk so that players can see what's going on, and they just tell me what they want to do. It still kind of feels a little bit like we're playing at the table, and it saves me a lot of time, because I would have anywhere from, if I'm lucky, I would have an hour each week to prepare for my game. And we're playing for about 3 hours. Or I might have half an hour or 15 minutes. In some cases, it might even only be 5 minutes. So I have to get it done fast. So I can't afford to have a lot of my time invested in Roll20. Do I think it's a good tool? I think a lot of virtual tables can be good tools. Yeah. All right, let's Roll20. Let's move on. Boss Bully Boy. Hey, how's it going? Finally caught a live stream. Thanks so much for your content. It's been the most helpful on YouTube. I try very hard to try and give everybody something that's useful, rather than something that is just going to appease the machine. Which means I often have made videos that have done very badly. Very badly. I will continue to do so. But not always. Sometimes I won't. Okay, so what do you got here, Joe? I really hope they make a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition advanced. So you can just use advanced rule sets without ruling out 5th edition rules altogether. Yeah, I think so. Here's the thing. I know a lot of people would like a Dungeon Master Guide too that had, like advanced rules. So this is your optional rules, your variant rules. There's a reason why Dungeon Coach is so popular and why he's grown so quickly. It's because people want to test out new stuff. Not everybody. It's not for everybody. But there's a lot of people, there's a big market who really want that. Okay? Now, one of the things that I've been working on is the Dungeon Master Roundtable. And I also had a discussion with Dave over at Nerdarchy on optional rules, things that could have been or should have been optional or variant rules in the player's handbook. And I can assure you it is only a matter of time before you see a video where we talk about stripping some of the mechanics from Dungeons & Dragons core rule system and making them optional or variant rules and giving you some pros and cons on that. And I'm hoping that Alan will help me with that, and of course Wally DM, because me and Wally hang out a lot. So I think that is going to definitely come eventually at some point. It won't be necessarily about adding new variant rules, because I think there's a lot of people who are doing that, and Dungeon Coach is doing a pretty good job. But I do think that Wizards of the Coast should have another book that is very much around the Dungeon Master, just because the first one wasn't that great. Zeno, I think it's Zeno. If I got your name wrong, I'm sorry. Yeah, it is a little bit disappointing, a little bit. Yeah, okay, so yeah, a customizable starting adventure, yeah, might have been useful. I think in terms of adventure creation, I think that probably the smart thing would have been to give you a flow chart, to give you an idea of what the structure of an adventure was, the different bits that you might need, and how they sort of look. That would have certainly been useful. You like the meme from Fredo? Good. I'm glad you did. Excellent. Okay. A random encounters book for DMs would add value as well. Yeah, so one of the things you've got to understand with the Dungeon Master Guide is that when you look at the random encounters section, it's just not what it's just not what people needed, and it's not enough. Even I know it's not the in thing, the modern thing to use random encounters and wandering monsters are often overlooked and looked down on as being a waste of your time and not getting to the point of your adventure. But if they're done right, they can work very well. Okay, I don't think that Wizards of the Coast has ever been able to put it out in a supplement and do it well, unfortunately. What's that? Lex Buddy. You're having a good laugh there. I'm not sure what that means, but if you're laughing, if I've educated you or made you laugh, I've succeeded. And if I haven't educated you, maybe I've at least given you an opportunity to look at things maybe the same way you were looking at it, but hopefully maybe in a different way. Okay, what else have we got here? Slice of Scott. When I was first approached to be a dungeon master, I was scrambling to figure out how to just spend an hour with my players. A simple 1 hour scenario example would have done wonders. YouTube saved me. Yes. See, one of the things that Mike Murnals had said when they were putting out Dungeons & Dragons 5e, and they never did this, is they said they would release videos on the internet that would show and explain how to play the game. And you can't count Acquisitions Incorporated and a lot of the live stream games as examples of how to play the game. Okay? This is why this channel was made. So when I first started making videos, I made a lot of rules videos on how the mechanics of the game worked, because they're still quite complicated for people. And if English is not your first language, you will struggle to understand what the heck's going on. A lot of people watch my videos, don't speak English as a first language, and struggle to figure out what's going on just because I didn't even break them down and make them simple enough. And I know for some people are like, wow, what's the big deal? If they can't figure it out, don't let them play the game, and they just don't play. I'm not really about that. I'm about getting everybody playing the game, okay? I'm about making it easier for you to play the game. So that's why I made those videos. But Wizards of the Coast did always say that they were going to make those types of videos. And they've only started making a couple just recently, which they've got on their YouTube channel. And they should have done that like 7 years ago. Right. Hello, Jeff. How's it going? Question. I'm going to lose my voice. At some point, I need to check to make sure that Wally DM, AJ Pickett, is it Jordan, the PH is silent, and Dungeon Dad are all good, and that I'm not required to step in. So if you suddenly see me running off, it's probably because somebody couldn't turn up to the Dungeon Master Roundtable discussion, and I need to go and attend. But hopefully that doesn't happen. So if you see me sort of doing something a bit weird in the background, that's probably what's going on. And yes, you're going to see a bunch of videos with Wally DM, AJ Pickett, Jordan the PH is silent, and Dungeon Dad together. Not separate, not shot separately, in the same conversation, in the same video chat, covering a number of different topics. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. Tristan, what do you got here? Tristan the Moose. What is your favourite setting in 5e? I also would like your thoughts on the new Ravenloft book. I think the new Ravenloft book is going to do very well. I think a lot of people love the idea. Do I know enough about the book? No, because I don't have the book yet. I'm in New Zealand. It will take me about a month. When I get the book, I will do another live stream video. We will talk about the book. I will talk about it. There are people already talking about this book right now. But I'm not going to do it the way that you might think. I'm probably not going to read out screens of information off the book. I'm going to assess the book and tell you what I think of the book. And be as honest and straight to the point as I possibly can. But I like the idea of the book. I think that's fine. In terms of my favourite setting, well, I would say I am very partial to Dark Sun. The only problem with Dark Sun is I like Dark Sun more than the players do. I've probably used the Forgotten Realms more than anything else. Do I have a favourite? You know, I don't know that I specifically have a favourite. I mean, just because I use the Forgotten Realms a lot doesn't mean it's my favourite. It's just convenient. Yeah, I would say I don't necessarily have a favourite campaign setting. If I were to have a favourite campaign setting, it's the campaign setting that me and the players create. Because from time to time, I will make a homebrew world, and it will just be a continent map, as I've said before in the past, and I just get them to name the world, and we have a starting location. I might have a town map, that's it. That's our starting point, and I just add things in. Often I will get the players to create the names and places in the world for me. They will come up with that stuff, and I will add it in as we play the adventure. So those are thoughts of, yeah, so I guess that would be my favourite. In terms of pre-made campaign worlds, I don't know that any of them have really stood out as being that fantastic. Yeah. Okay, Jeff, I missed your question, Jeff, did I? Yeah, I have. Question, do you use optional rules in the DMG for combat, such as flanking or movement, where every other time you move diagonally costs 10 feet of movement? Okay, that's a good question, Jeff, and I do apologise for skipping past you. Okay, so here's the thing. I would use flanking, but every time I've presented flanking to my players, I word it this way. I am happy for us to use flanking in the game, but you have to understand that if you get to use flanking, so do my monsters. And I can assure you I will have probably more monsters than you guys have characters. Do you still want to do it? And every single time the players have always said, no way. No way. We don't want you to have that kind of advantage. You know, for you to have flanking on us with all your creatures would just be horrible. In a situation where there's a solo monster, they might say, can we have flanking? And I don't just present that at the beginning of our campaign and say, they can. I've had players come up to me just before a battle starts and say, do we want to have flanking? And I will say to them, well, you can, but I would prefer that you just say, can we have flanking at the beginning of the session? Rather than tailor it based on the number of monsters you know you're going to have to fight. So if at the beginning of the session you are happy to have flanking, but you don't necessarily know if you're going to be fighting a horde of monsters or just a solo monster or just a couple of monsters or a legendary creature, then that's all good. Then you understand that I will get the advantage against you when I have more monsters. And my players will almost always, I don't think there's been a case, maybe once, that they've said, yes, we want flanking. It's very rare. So I don't use it a lot, but I have in the past. As for diagonal movement, we're talking about diagonal movement that was used back in version 3 and version 3.5 of Dungeons & Dragons. I always thought it was stupid. It didn't make any sense. It was confusing. I don't use it in Dungeons & Dragons 5e. I don't even present it as an option in my games. And because I played tabletop war games, I used to play Warhammer and Warhammer 40k. I used to play tabletop war games where we used a measuring tape, where everything had to be very accurate. We didn't use squares. We weren't measuring in squares. And what I've found is that type of movement where you move diagonally 5 foot for the first square, the second square is 10 feet, and then the next square would be 5 foot, and then again the next square would be 10 foot. I know people put out the argument that mathematically it makes sense. But my degree is in psychology and mathematics, and I can assure you that Pythagoras did not measure a triangle in squares. Okay, Pythagoras used measurement. Okay, Pythagoras was using a measurement system, not squares. It doesn't work with squares. And I have actually, in a live stream, I actually showed people with a measuring tape the difference. And you actually wind up moving significantly slower and less distance by using that movement system. So I don't use it. I just take squares as squares. You're measuring in squares. If you're going diagonally and you want to go 6 squares and you're going to move 30 feet, 6 squares. If you're going horizontally or vertically, 6 squares is 30 feet. That's it. I think that is the best way to go, in my opinion. I know people will disagree with me. Maybe one day I will care enough to do a video and actually demonstrate it. But I can imagine the backlash would be immense. Will that worry me too much? Probably not. But, can I be bothered? I kind of feel like I would be making that video for people who would despise me for making that video in the first place, rather than for trying to explain to people, that it doesn't make any sense. So, I don't think it's worth worrying about for me. Okay. Hopefully that answered your question, Jeff. Fender. What do you got here? I always saw the DMG as a pain in the butt to use. Yeah, it is. It does take on that feel, doesn't it? It certainly does feel like it. When I open it, half the book suggests me to do more work as a DM rather than offer me short-term solutions. Yeah, or especially to improvise. Yeah, you need the Dungeon Master guide to actually help reduce your workload. And if it doesn't do the workload for you, then why would you have it in the first place? That's the question, right? It is the same question that people ask when they are using pre-made adventures. If I have to spend hours, months preparing a pre-made adventure that's come out from Wizards of the Coast in a hardback book or anybody else, why not just homebrew everything if that's really what I'm having to deal with? It's too much work. So they have to make stuff that is actually easy to use. All right. Questions. Scott. Yes, and yes, Fendar does have a good point. He usually does, actually. Fredo, what do you got here? Same. Roll20 used to really lose me with the time consumption. Yes, exactly. I tried to use GIMP as well to make sure I could. Yeah. In the end, efficiency is video chat, Zoom, theatre of the mind, or just set up. I can set up the battle map really quickly, like much faster than I could ever do anything on a virtual tabletop. And my players love it when I do that. Even though it's still more time consuming than theatre of the mind, my players love that I put out a battle map and use my webcam and my miniatures. It takes them right back to the experience they had at the table when we were sitting in the same room. Al Bear Rodeo. I've heard about that. Somebody did mention that. Okay. Anyways, it's about 2:30 a.m. Oh my gosh, where I am. All the best, great information. Okay, he's probably gone by now. What's this? Lux Buddy, how's it going? Fendar, the DMG has great resources and no DM should ignore checking it out, but it's just so sparse. Yes, that's right. I would first check out the older DMGs. Yeah, that does tend to be what people do. And of course, a lot of the old DMGs you can access online, so you don't even have to go and buy it because they're older books. Hi, Derek. How's it going? White Rhino. It's been a while, right? I know. It's been so long since you've been in one of my chats. Is Dark Sun like a Conan type setting, low magic, I guess? It's an apocalypse world. The world is coming to an end. It's desert world, basically. Dark Sun. Tristan, what else? How is Conan low magic? Yeah, Conan was never really low magic. Conan was actually very, very much magic. Thank you, Jasper, for the super chat. Thank you very much. Yeah, I am. I'm not. It's actually quite cold here, so I'm not burning up. The weather has changed significantly. Okay, Derek. Yeah, magic is outlawed, so you've got to be careful about where you use it, otherwise you can get into a lot of trouble. The only people in Dark Sun who can use magic and get away with it are the sorcerers. And there's only a few of them, and they are trouble, generally. A lot of trouble. Tristan, I don't know. I played it like what's that? I'm not too sure what that means. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think we have covered everything. Yeah, Fender. I don't think that because Dungeons and Dragons is American, I don't think that it's likely that they're going to go metric anytime soon. Because the only people who in my country who use Imperial are engineers, because they have to deal with parts made in metric sizes and parts made in Imperial size, and therefore they need to know both. 90 degrees where you are. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. I better get going. Otherwise, you guys are going to lose your mind and think this video is just way too long and that I'm live streaming for the rest of my life. That could possibly happen. So I'm going to disappear and see if Wally DM and the other guys are doing all right. And I will be back. There will be more videos released that aren't live streams. And I am trying to reformat and readjust how I do things since YouTube changed everything. And hopefully this was useful to you. So wherever you are in the world, whether it be the morning, the afternoon, the night, or the early morning, please look after yourself, your family, and your friends. Be nice to your neighbours. Be nice to your neighbours. And hey, till next time, Keep rolling those 20s.